Hello everybody, my name is Tatьяна. I'm a language teacher and teacher trainer at Higher School of Economics in Moscow, and today I'm going to give you another webinar on feedback which we give to our students when assessing their learning. And today we're going to focus more on on the feedback which we give to our learners when assessing their writing, and more specifically we're going to focus on different error correction strategies that we can use when correcting linguistic mistakes in our students' writing. Now, I have already given a webinar on general principle of giving feedback to our learners, but I'm going to go through the main points that we discussed last time, so that those of you who were not able to join us on Monday could actually just make sure that they are on the same page with us, right? So right now I would like to write down the features of effective feedback. You can reflect upon your own experience of giving feedback to your learners or receiving feedback from teachers as students, or think of what we did or what we talked together last time, and write down in the comment sections the features of effective teacher feedback. Okay? I'm waiting for your answers. Good evening, everybody. What makes our feedback effective? What makes our feedback motivating? How can we actually contribute to our students' learning when giving feedback? How can we use feedback as an effective tool to facilitate our students' learning? Okay? So, the first feature of effective feedback, which we talked about, as you might remember, was encouragement, right? So it is very important that our feedback is encouraging. And do you remember how can we make our feedback encouraging? What can we do what strategies can we use to make our feedback really motivating, to actually get our students interested in the subject, to make them want to learn? You remember? So one of the ways of making our feedback encouraging was actually, if you remember, giving praise, right? But is it a good idea to actually focus on praise a lot when giving feedback to our learners? Do you think it's a good idea? Well, actually, it might not be a good idea to focus on praise only, right? Of course, it is a very good idea to highlight the strengths of the student work, right, or performance, but we should also include maybe some constructive criticism, right, and maybe a little action plan, but definitely we should not forget about actually letting our students know what is good about writing, right? About their writing or speaking, about their performance, right? Another way of making our feedback effective, if you remember, effective and motivating, keeping it just in a way that we delivering like a personal message to our students, right? Trying to actually maintain this ongoing conversation between us and our learners, right? And kind of let them know through feedback that we are there to help them, right? Not to assess them, not to take points off from their final grade, but actually we're there to help them, and we're as interested in their progress as pretty much they are, right? Okay. Another feature of effective feedback, well, as you remember probably, is the fact that our feedback should be mainly task involving. Now, when giving feedback to our learners, we might not want to focus too much or actually at all on their personality, but rather on the way they did the task, right? So instead of saying, John, you're such a smart boy, you're so talented, right? You're just amazing, you're the best student in this class, right? We might probably say, John, this is a very strong piece of writing. You have made a great progress, right? So keep up the good work, right? So we want to focus on the way our students did the task rather than on their personal characteristics, right? Another feature of good feedback is that it should be genuine. Now, if obviously we want to encourage our learners, right, and want to support them, but sometimes there's clearly nothing to praise our students for. In this case, it is not a good idea to say, good job overall, right, if it is clearly not. In this case, I remember you gave some great tips last time. You can say something like, well, John, I'm sure I like knowing the way you can do these types of tasks, you can do better last time, right? Or you can comment on the progress, right? For example, but actually there almost always something you can find something to praise our learners for, right, when commenting on their performance. But you should be genuine, you should be nice, you should be supportive, your feedback should be encouraging and motivating, but you should not lie. You shouldn't tell our students something which actually is not there, right? If it's not very good piece of writing, don't say that it is, right? Another feature of effective feedback is that it should be well balanced, right? We remember, and as I have already mentioned before, we do give our students praise, right? But we also should give them a little action plan, right? And comment on the things that our students should focus on more and should work on more, right? But when we're talking about criticism, we should remember that it should be constructive. Constructive means helpful, right? Whenever we're criticizing our students' learning, we should always think, okay, I am criticizing right now, but is it helpful, right? When we say poor grammar, is it constructive? Probably not. I mean, that's like pretty obvious, and I'm pretty sure our student already knows that they're not very good at like using this or that grammar rule, right, correctly. So instead of saying obvious things to our learners all over again and killing their motivation in a way, we probably should actually think what we can offer them, right? A little action plan. Maybe we can be more specific to make it more constructive, right? Instead of saying poor grammar, what particular, what like bad, right? What is that particular thing that our students should focus on, right? When working on their grammar, right? Or how they can do that. Maybe we can refer them to certain resources. Maybe we can like give them a big kind of like goal, like share, right, with them like a big goal that they can achieve and break it into smaller tasks, right? So we always should ask ourselves if the criticism that we give to our learners is actually helpful, right? It should be selective. Now, we do not want to overwhelm our learners with the whole, like, with loads and loads of comments, especially written in red pen, right? This is really overwhelming and very often demotivating, right? The more things we pick up to focus on in our feedback, the less focused our students are on each and every bit, right, covered in our feedback. Now, choose from 2 to 4 most important points. Now, I'm talking about formative assessment and like when teaching a class, right? I'm not talking right now about the final stages of preparing our learners to a high stakes exam, right? I'm talking about the regular work in class in the middle of a school term, right? Yeah, be focused, therefore you can focus the attention of our learners on specific things, and they can like work better and more effectively on them, right? And again, not being selective sometimes kills the motivation of our learners. I've given an example from the assessment of written work of our learners, right? Giving them back a red copy, a piece of paper all covered in red pen, right? But in speaking, it actually can be, we might sometimes just interrupt our students all the time. They want to say something and we interrupt them correcting their mistakes, right? Let them speak. Let them speak and highlight the most important bits which you would like to focus on and which are the most important for this particular piece of writing. Okay. Feedback should be ideally personalized, right? Our students, in order again to make it motivating, our students should have that feeling that we actually did put thought into how they in particular can improve their results, right? And like we are thinking about them and their learning, and we're not just giving generic comments which are all the same to all students in class, right? It should be very personalized. How can we make it personalized? Well, we can address them by name, right? We can refer maybe to their previous works, right? And say, well, John, I can clearly see that, remember I highlighted this bit? Much better right now, right? So this is like the positive bit of your feedback. However, now there is another thing that we should focus on in our subsequent pieces of writing, and this is this one. So referring to our students' previous works or their general performance can be a very good idea, right? Can make it really personalized. Yes? So these are characteristics of effective feedback, right? Which I have just covered very briefly. But today we're going to focus on the feedback which we give to our learners when assessing their writing. Right now, I am very curious about what you think on that matter. So how often, I would like you to write in the comments, in the comment section, how often you mark your students' writing, and if you do that, then what type of written works you usually work with, okay? What level of students it normally is, what genres, right, of written work it is. Maybe it's a personal letter, maybe these are essays, maybe you're preparing your students for the written part of state exams, maybe it's creative writing, right? Maybe you're writing poems with your learners. It all is very interesting, so will you please let me know? And while I'm waiting for your answers, I think I'm going to start with another question to you, actually. You keep thinking and letting me know about how much you grade your students' writing, right, on a daily basis, and what types of student writing these are, right? But you're also thinking, of the answers to these questions, and like whether you agree with the statement that you can see here or not. Now, a lot of teachers, including myself, claim that assessing student writing is one of the most challenging professional tasks of a teacher, of a language teacher. I totally agree with that. The most challenging, the most time-consuming, right? And yeah, it takes a lot of time and energy, and it's the most challenging because when doing it, we might really be focused, right? Will you please let me know if you agree, if it is so for you as well, or maybe you're really passionate about grading your student writing, then share it with us too, please, and let us know what in particular you like about the process of assessing student written works, okay? So why, and then you might want to think, why do some teachers think that this is a very challenging task, and what are actually the challenges? What makes this task so difficult for many teachers, especially for the beginners, right? For beginners, for teachers who have just started working with their learners. All right. Okay, I can see that some of you grade students letters, right? Once a week, and creative writing several times per month. Yeah, I think assessing students like regular written works is challenging, but honestly, assessing students' creative writing might be even I don't know, 3 times more challenging, right? Because you're dealing with their like creativity, right? With their talent. You don't want to kill their motivation, right? And yeah, at all. Okay, students write essay compositions. Yeah, okay, we're going to try out different error correction strategies when actually working with real student essays and compositions. So that might be relevant to you. Now, let's maybe go through the challenges that some teachers might face when assessing student written works, and this is one of them, right? Tired of grading papers, A's for everyone. What problem is here? What is so problematic? I mean, A's like 5, right? To everybody. Amazing, 5 to everybody, and I'm free, right? And this is actually what some teachers do, and that might be a problem when there are several teachers working in the same class, and there is one teacher who does this, which makes them like students' favorite teacher, right? And there are other teachers who don't do this, and they're like the bad teachers in class, right? So what problem is that? Actually, sometimes it is understandable, right? Sometimes it might happen, but what is the reason behind that? Well, probably the fact that it is really time consuming, right? And when you have a lot of students and you have this pile of works to grade, and usually we grade them, well, in our office hours, which is very often not enough. This is usually that piece of work which we take home, right? And of course, this is not the most favorite thing to do over the weekend, right? Of course, it might be for some teachers, but because it is really time consuming and it is really very tiring, we might just end up losing our focus, right? When grading a huge pile of works, right? We can become less focused, and our objectivity when assessing student writing might actually suffer, right? We might be very energetic and motivating in the beginning of the pile, right? And grade the first 2-3 works with a lot of passion. picking up on different mistakes, writing extensive comments, right, to our learners, and towards the end of the pile, we might lose that energy, that motivation, right? So a little life hack can be, as obvious as it sounds, just think, like, manage your time properly, think in advance, and maybe divide that pile into 3-4 smaller piles, and do it, like, spend, I don't know, half an hour, 1 hour a day doing it, right? Instead of leaving it all till the weekend when you don't really have much time to do that, and we might tend to be less attentive, right? So our attention spans, right, not infinite. So yes. Another problem that we might face when marking our student writing is this. I'll give you 1 minute to look through the comments. So obviously that's a teacher, right? And that's what she's writing to her student, whose name is Temi. And that's Temi. And this is the comment that she has just received from the teacher, right? Will you please read those 2 comments? So meanwhile, I'll just look through the types of writing that you usually assess. So we have final test essays, right? Well, final test, it might be actually summative assessment, right? We don't always give feedback when conducting summative assessment, though it can actually be a very good idea, right? But we very often assess our students or mark our students' written works on a daily or weekly basis, right? Maybe once every 2 weeks, just regular written works, right? For the purpose of maybe giving feedback, right? Okay, so here's a teacher, and she says, Temi, your thesis is like a paper, right? Your written work was good, but I don't, no, sorry, that was not a teacher. Teacher, Temi, your thesis was good, but you did not back it up with evidence, right? You didn't write strong arguments and from the text, right? Let's meet to talk about the ways of improving the paper. Now, do you think that it's a good example of teacher feedback? Is it specific? Well, I would say that it's pretty specific, right? I'm not just saying not good enough, right? Not really well done, or poor grammar, or work on your content, right? No, it's actually pretty specific, right? The arguments are not really very strong, right? You didn't use the arguments from the text. Now, is it motivating? I think it actually is, right? Your thesis was good overall. Now, we might, though, make it a bit more specific. We might actually include some kind of commenting on what in particular was good about this thesis, right? But overall, looks like a sandwich, right? Then, is it personalized? I would say so, right? The teacher addresses her student by name, right? And does it include an action plan? I would say that it does, right? Not maybe in the comment per se, but the teacher actually says, let's meet up and think together what we can do, right, to improve your piece of writing. Now, I can see that, well, Victoria says that the second example of feedback is horrible. I do agree that it's horrible, but who wrote the second example of feedback? Who wrote it? Another teacher? No, it was actually this teacher, and she actually wrote this. But this is what her student read, or like inferred, right? Took away from the feedback that he received. Now, what did Temi understand? So how did he interpret this feedback? Timmy, your thesis was good, but I don't like you. No matter how hard you work in this class, you'll never do well because I don't like you. Now, obviously, there is some communication breakdown going on here, right? And what do you think the problem is? Now, you probably understand, right, that this, like, there is one comment written by her to Timmy, by this teacher to Timmy. Now, actually, we don't really know if, I would say that this is what the teacher meant to write, right? And this is what Timmy inferred, like interpret, this is how he interpreted. But we actually don't know what's in the middle. Like, the teacher meant to write this, but did she actually write this? If Timmy read it in this way, right? So there is like communication breakdown, but who is to blame in this situation? What do you think? To be honest, I must say that it's probably a teacher, right? It's our job to know our learners, to know their strengths, weaknesses, maybe to be aware of their personal characteristics, to be aware of how they can interpret this or that type of feedback, right? And it's our job to think of what to write in our feedback and how to write it, right? So that like something like this doesn't happen, right? So what is the problem here? Absolutely, teacher, I do agree. Alena, Yelena have just said that it's a teacher, right, whose responsibility is to make sure that this doesn't happen. Again, proper wording, right? Maybe looking up some phrases, right? Because sometimes when formulating, especially if English is not our native, is not our first language, we might sound a bit ruder than we actually want to sound, right? We might sound a bit more harsh than we mean it, right? So just being exposed to different examples of teacher feedback in English and looking through different effective phrases which you can borrow and use when giving feedback to your learners in English can actually be a good idea, right? And in this course later on we're going to have a look at some effective phrases which you can use when giving feedback to your learners, and we're going to have a look at more examples of feedback, right? Okay, now I have one more problem. I think we have already mentioned that, right? Do you sometimes feel like this? You might, especially if it's at the end of the school term, right? Okay, so it's really time consuming and we should probably break the pile, right, into several pieces, like into several piles, and be more focused, be more motivated. And okay, and what's written actually here? Hilda begins to think she should have attended the panel on minimal marking at last month's conference of writing teachers, right? So what is the problem here, apart from the fact that this teacher just has a lot to grade? What can the problem be? She should have attended the seminar on minimal marking. Probably it takes too long to mark the works because that teacher might actually be focusing on too many things in every single piece of writing, right? Again, be focused, be selective. One of the features of effective feedback, which we mentioned in the very beginning, right? Not only is it more effective when it comes to student learning, but it is also more reasonable when it comes to your time management, right? Okay. Now, these are all the challenges and all the questions which we should ask ourselves when assessing student writing, when preparing, when learning how our student works, right? And by looking at all these questions, we might actually get a little bit intimidated, right? A little bit scared of that professional, of the perspective, right? Of performing that professional task, because obviously sometimes it's not very easy to understand whether there is a mistake, right? Again, especially if we're not native speakers, right? Sometimes what we think is incorrect might actually be correct, right? And overcorrection is a very common trend when it comes to assessing student writing, very common among non-native English speakers. Again, we don't want to overcorrect, right? Not only is it demotivating, correcting even something that our student who struggled a lot to produce that piece of writing, correcting something that is actually correct, right? This is something that we really want to stay away from, right? So my tip number 1 will be checking all the time. If you read something, of course, if these are not like obvious mistakes, but if you read something and when in doubt, before offering or suggesting your own way of saying it, check if it is correct or not. Check, go to Google and check it in inverted commas, just making sure that there are a lot of threads, right, and a lot of web pages from, including reputable websites, right, with the same, with the way our student formulated their thought or idea, right? And I have actually learned from my personal experience that if you start checking even something that you think you're sure of, you will learn so many exciting things about this world and the English language. Check even if you think that you're right? Just check, just make sure. Number 1 tip for all language teachers, right? We want to stay away from overcorrection, right? Sometimes we do find a mistake, but again, being governed by the principle of being selective, we should think, is it really so important to correct this one right now, right? Maybe if there are a lot of mistakes of other types which are more crucial to be corrected in this very piece of writing, you might maybe leave it out, right? Maybe if it's more or less okay, you might just keep it this way. Maybe it's anyway too hard for your student to grasp right now at this level. Don't go deep into it, right? Don't start teaching the things that are too early to teach to them right now, right? So how do I stay objective, right? You remember? Well, that's a tough question. Maybe reading carefully assessment criteria, right? Actually paying attention to them more and more can be a good idea. Maybe looking through several, maybe marking one paper, marking another, then going back to the first paper and compare if you are consistent in your marking and in your grading. This is another thing to think about, right? How much feedback is too much? Now, good balance, right, is the key here. We don't want to write more than the student actually wrote in their piece of writing, right? We should be selective and focus on the things which we want to highlight. But another question is, how do I choose what are the things to focus on in this particular piece of writing, right? What should I write in my commentary? And a very important thing is what language, what structures do I use in my final commentary, because again, when teaching English, especially through English, we want to, we actually inevitably provide a model of a real language, right? Provide our students with the model of the language use. We don't want to make mistakes in the feedback which we give to our learners, especially if it's written commentary and especially if it stays with them in their copybooks. We don't want to use the language unnaturally, right, when giving feedback, but sometimes it's not really that easy. Okay, we should again focus on main mistakes. Exactly. We should firstly correct very common mistakes. That's what Alexandra says, and I do agree. We should focus on certain types of mistakes, right? We shouldn't correct everything, especially, I mean, if it's a quite strong piece of writing and there are not that many mistakes, we might actually then focus on some things that we probably wouldn't focus on in another piece of writing, just because why not, right? If it's not too much, right? But generally just focus on something which is more important for that particular piece of writing. Now, what are the types of teacher feedback in the English language classroom? If you remember, we touched upon it last time, right? Feedback can be like spoken, right? Feedback can be written. Can you give me some other types of teacher feedback which we mentioned last time? Or if you maybe are for the first time with us here, if you didn't watch the previous video, you can just think of some types of feedback that you know of, that you have heard of, or maybe that you use in your day-to-day professional dealings, right? In your at work. Okay, and I'll meanwhile read some of your comments, give opportunities to guess what mistakes our students have made. Alexandra, this is something we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes. Amazing. This is one of the best strategies you can go with, and we're going to talk about it in detail in a couple of minutes. Thank you so much. Now, when talking about feedback delivered in class, it can be, if you remember, immediate, right? If I correct the mistakes right away, if I hear a mistake and I correct it. Now, I can do it verbally, I can do it non-verbally, right? I can just like show something to your learner, like past tense, right? Or maybe cringe. There was some teachers don't really like that strategy, but sometimes we can kind of show maybe like a questioning, like, well, have like this face expression which asks question, right? Or like doubt a little bit. Yeah, but we might stay away from doing it, right? And we might just wait till the end of a speaking activity, right? And deliver our feedback to our learner later on. So it can be delayed and it can be immediate, right? In terms of the amount of feedback which we give to our learners, it can be brief, right? Or just like very brief comments, very general comments, right? Like very good introduction, or kind of like some problems with the tenses, right? Present, perfect, past simple, just very brief comment on only one thing, or it can actually be elaborate, right, more detailed, like the final comment which you write to your learner at the end of your written work, at the end of their written work, right, under their piece of writing. Now, another type of feedback which we normally single out is the type of feedback which aims at correcting students' mistakes. Now, can you think of the name for that type of feedback which aims at correcting students' mistakes, or maybe their learning, the learning strategies they use, but mainly their mistakes? Maybe you remember the term? Well, we normally say that it's corrective feedback, right? So corrective feedback aims at correcting student learners, and written corrective feedback is the feedback which we use when correcting errors in our student writing. Right? Now, when marking our student written works, we might focus on these things, right? We might focus on the content of their writing, on the content and structure, right? On the ideas and how well they're organized in their piece of writing, right? And we also focus on the language, right? On language accuracy. So these are two things which we focus on. Now, by content, I mean content like the ideas and the way our student organized them, right? And well, communicative achievement, right? Whether they answered the question or not, and the linguistic language resources that they chose to deliver those ideas to their hypothetical reader, right? And obviously, feedback as an integral part of all formative assessment procedures, right? It's very important to let our students know how well they performed when doing this or that task. And in this, today, we're actually going to focus on language-focused feedback when assessing our students' writing, grading their papers, right? Now, when we assess, it's much better to correct mistakes with green pen. I do agree, Alexandra, thank you so much. Very good comment, very good remark. Now, a lot of schools, I don't know if it is what you do in your schools as well, please let me know. But I have heard, I don't really know for sure, but I've heard that many schools now try not to use red color, any other color, but not red, maybe green or like purple or something like that, but not red. They claim that it's really demotivating, so let me know. Yeah, we should avoid red, right? They marked mistakes in red color here, so another example of not very motivating feedback, maybe, right? Yeah, but traditionally teachers marked student works in red color. Now there is a tendency not to use red color. But it's up to you to decide, right? So, now let's think of the process of correcting students' language mistake in their piece of writing, and let's try to break it into stages. Like, what do we do? Imagine we have like a paragraph to mark, to find mistakes and correct them in a piece of student writing. So what are the steps that we take to do that? We'll start off with reading it probably, right? And then what are the steps? So first we read and then we probably find a mistake, right? We find a mistake, so linguistic error detection, right? We find a mistake. Once we found a mistake, what do? We need to correct it, right? But in order to correct it, we need to understand a couple of things, right? Okay, so a lot of people agree with Alexandra. We should not use a red color, right? Very good. Thank you so much. It's so important to know what our language teachers community thinks, and this is actually quite a topical issue in the writing teachers circles, whether to use red color or not. So yeah, personally I don't really like red color either. So we find a mistake, we detect it, right? We are about to correct it, but before correcting it, what should we think of? It's very important to understand what type of mistake it is and what nature of the mistake. What's the nature of this mistake? Like, what is the reason why our student made this mistake when producing this piece of writing? Because depending on that, we might choose different error correction strategies, right? Well, sometimes, again, if we remember, if we were being governed by those principles of delivering feedback to our learners, right? We might really try to be selective. Now we need to understand, okay, we found this mistake, but did our student make this mistake because they know the rule, they know that grammar pattern, they just failed to use it properly, right, and correctly? Maybe it was a memory lapse, maybe it was attention lapse, right? And maybe they can actually, as Alexandra pointed out, maybe it can actually be something that they can correct themselves, right? Then should we actually correct it? Probably not, but should we let our student know that they've made a mistake? Probably yes, because not all students have this tendency to reread their pieces of writing unless we ask them to do that, right? So, yeah, check whether there are mistakes, as Alona says, and whether they need being corrected, right? And we need to understand what type of mistake it is, why our student made this mistake, and that will lead us to making decision what strategy to choose when correcting their mistakes. We're going to talk about different strategies of correcting students' mistake in their writing very soon. But first, I have a question. Look at these words. They are all synonyms, right? But what's the difference? What's the difference between these three terms, right? They're all synonyms and they are all used to refer to our students' writing, when we're talking about assessing student writing, right? Something incorrectly, but still there is some difference between all of them, right? We have mistakes, we have errors, and we have slips, right? Okay, Viktor Petrov has just said sometimes we can just point the place where the mistake is and offer our student and like suggest that our students correct this mistake by themselves. Exactly, and this is one of the strategies that we can go with, and this is one of the strategies that I'm going to share with you right now. But you know, some of you know them already. I'm glad to see that. Okay, so what's the difference between mistakes, errors, and slips? Now, I will help you. Yeah, that's what Alona says. A slip can be forgiven and not corrected. Now, I do agree that a slip can be forgiven, but I am not quite sure if we can just not correct it. Maybe, as Victor and Alexandra have mentioned already, they can actually, it can be like highlighted, right, or underlined, and our students can receive a task to correct this slip themselves. Why? Because a slip is actually a mistake which is made accidentally, right? For example, when our student misspelled a word or forgot one letter, but that's usually the result of the attention lapse, and if we redirect the attention of our learner to that particular word or to that particular phrase, they will understand it right away. Oh yeah, sure, I'm sorry. Maybe they were in a rush finishing that piece of writing to hand it in to you as soon as possible, right? And they actually started missing letters, right? sometimes even teachers, right, or people who know the language or their subject very well, and native speakers do make this type of mistakes. They do make slips because this is just a natural thing that happens all the time. So this is like kind of like the least serious out of those three, right? Okay, yeah, they can usually correct slips themselves. Now let's have a look at an error. An error is a very specific type of mistake, and an error usually stems from the lack of knowledge. An error is made when our student probably has never heard this or that rule, right? Or have never said this or that thing before in the English language, right? And they just simply do not have sufficient language resources to do that. That's why they make this mistake. For example, if we are writing, let's say we have just studied past tense in our class, right? And we want to give some free practice to our learners to talk in class, and we ask the questions that will get them to use that rule. For example, what did you do yesterday? Share with your partner, right? What you did last summer or yesterday or last weekend, right? And we may actually want to give them this chance of free practice at home by asking them to write a free, kind of like freer piece of writing, a composition about what they did last summer. Obviously, our student might want to share all those exciting things that he or she did last summer with you, right? They're really very motivated, they want to do that, but they don't have enough language resources to do that. They can make mistakes in the past simple form, but they can make a whole bunch of other mistakes. And when they give their piece of writing to you, there can be slips, there can be mistakes, and there can be errors. The errors is something that they really wanted to express, but at this stage failed to do it correctly, right? Now with errors, we should always think if this is an important thing to be corrected right here, right now, or if we can actually accept it right now and think about it at the later stages, right? Later on in our course. And then a mistake, well, this is the classification that some researchers use in their papers, and this is something that we use in our research. A mistake is something that stems from the lack of practice. Now, this is something that our student kind of knows already, but they haven't had enough practice yet. So they haven't brought it to that level of using it automatically, correctly, right away. So this is something that a lot of students make. Now they have studied it already, they just haven't practiced enough. Now if we go back to that example of a composition about like how I spent my last summer, right, my summer, there can be errors and there can be mistakes. If our student misuses past simple in their piece of writing, and this is something that we talked about, let's say, in our class, in our lessons the previous week, we have already covered this topic. We have already looked at different verbs in past simple, right? Regular and irregular verbs. We have already done some controlled practice exercises, right? And they still misuse this rule. These are probably mistakes, right? Because they have already been exposed to this rule, they just haven't practiced them enough. If they make some other mistakes in the complex words about all sorts of different roller coasters that they went on last summer, right? Or I don't know, maybe they wanted to describe the beautiful nature that they saw last summer, but they just don't have enough like vocabulary to do that. They make errors, right? If they misspell some words that they obviously know, that is a slip, right? And depending on the type of mistake, we might use different error correction strategies. Okay, now just a little reference for you, right? Again, errors occur when our students don't have sufficient knowledge. Mistakes occur when our learners just haven't mastered this or that rule yet, and slips are accidental mistakes. Now, if we talk about errors, do we always correct them? What do you think? Do we always correct them? It depends, right? We might correct them, we might not, and if we don't correct all the errors, it's fine, because that might be too much at this stage of our students like learning, right? It can be a bit too overwhelming. Do we correct mistakes? Well, if our students have already learned this or that, then we might correct it ourselves, or we might get our learners to correct it themselves. Same with slips, right? Now, how do you usually mark your writing? Well, many of you have already mentioned, right, that we don't actually use a red color, right? So probably this, and this is not something that we, not the strategies that you, or not like the marking styles that you use when correcting your student writing, right? But yeah, you can use different symbols, and you just agree with your students that they understand your symbols, right? And now we're going to actually have a look at the typology of written corrective feedback, right? Of different strategies that our students can, that we can use when correcting student writing, right? Direct feedback. I think some of you have already mentioned direct feedback, right? When answering my question, what types of written corrective feedback are there, or what are different ways of correcting student writing. Now, have a look. What is direct feedback? What do we do when choosing this error correction strategy? Now, here with the word have, it's just crossed out, right? We cross out the word have, and we write like, let's say we insert an article, right? So here, okay, Margarita has just said, I think we should correct errors, but we should explain that it's okay that you don't know something yet. We should actually let our student know that, always know that they might not know something yet, but imagine there are mistakes in almost every single word of our, like in the piece of writing, right? Or like on every single line. If there are too many mistakes, we might actually want to be selective. Now again, if we're at our last stages of preparing our learners for an exam, we obviously focus on all mistakes to let our student know that well, this is where they are at the moment. But imagine our student tried to write like a composition to you about all the exciting things they did last summer, and they were so excited, so motivated, but they really made a lot of mistakes. They maybe even tried to use very complex tenses and they failed to do that correctly, and they're so motivated, they're waiting for you to give this paper back to you and maybe to give your reaction, and they receive the piece of paper like all marked. Like every single word is corrected, underlined, crossed out, circled, or something like that, right? It might be a bit demotivating. So sometimes we might actually be selective, right? Okay. But we actually correct the mistakes which are really important to be corrected at this stage, like tenses, for example, especially the tenses that they have already studied, right? Maybe some countable, uncountable nouns, right? Something that you have already studied at school, like with them in class, right? This is something that should definitely be corrected. Now, what type of strategy is that? I obviously here correct the mistakes. I detect the mistakes. I have bought a new book yesterday, so yesterday it's past simple. We don't need have, right? I cross it out and there is an article missing, right? And I actually give our student the correct way of writing it, right? I corrected it myself for our learner. And there can be indirect corrective feedback. Now, if this is a direct corrective feedback, I correct all the mistakes myself, and I actually give the correct version of writing this or that to our learner. There can be indirect corrective feedback, and what do? I just, as you have already mentioned, I have only underlined some bits of in the text, right, where there are mistakes, but I don't correct them myself because I want to do what? I want to get our student, like my student in this case, to correct it him or herself. Now there is, so there are two different types of correcting mistakes. Direct corrective feedback, I correct everything myself, I give them the correct answer. Indirect feedback, I don't correct it, I just let them know, right? There is a word missing, there is something incorrect over here, look at it. Now there is a very important condition which you should always meet when going for indirect corrective feedback. Actually, it might seem easier, right? You just underline, you don't get bothered to write things on top, right? You just underline, but actually it's a more time-consuming one because first of all, when you do this type, when you go with this type of strategy, right? You should make sure that you first of all get your students to correct it. You actually give them the task to correct it themselves, and you find time to go back to this piece of writing and check if they have corrected it, the way they should have corrected it, and that they did it correctly, right? So it's very important. I have heard from my students so many times that teachers just underline some bits of the text and they actually have no clue what's going on. They just receive their written works with some bits underlined. Does it mean that it's good? Doesn't mean that it's not very good. If it's not very good, then what's incorrect over here, right? When we do it, we make sure that our student knows how to correct it. They correct it themselves. They bring it back to us. Again, when we use this type of feedback, we should also make sure that our student is able to correct it themselves, right? Do we use indirect feedback with errors, for example? What are errors? Right? You remember that errors stem from the lack of knowledge. If our student doesn't really know it yet, they will never be able to correct it themselves. Maybe they'll ask for help from their private teacher or like from their parents, but what's the point then, right? We use this error correction strategy to like as a task, as like an additional task to work on their piece of writing. But that's a good one because it gives some additional, this is actually a task, it gives some additional kind of, we can give our students direct feedback and actually allocate some time in class to look through their mistakes and just make sure that they understand what the mistakes are and like why these are the mistakes, why they can't say it this way, right? But we can just make this task a little bit harder, right? We can change the complexity of looking through their piece of writing, right? Process and just ask them to correct the mistakes themselves. Now, even here, we can shift the level of complexity a little bit. I can write, I have bought a new book yesterday. Well, I can mark it in this way. I can highlight this word, which shouldn't be here actually. I can put a little tick here, which means there is one word missing, right? Or I can just imagine put 2 ticks here to let our student know that in this line there are 2 mistakes. Find them yourself, like detect them yourself, correct them yourself. There are 2 mistakes. I'm not even letting you know where in particular these mistakes are, right? And this is even harder than this, right? So I can play around the way I do it to change the complexity of this error correction task, right? So, or you can make it a bit, instead of putting just 2 ticks here, you can make it a bit less challenging and say, in this line, there is one problem with the tense, with the use of the tense, and one problem with the use of an article, right? And therefore they know that they should look for like into this bit, right? Because this is all about tenses, and here probably there is an article. They should think, should it be there, right? And therefore you kind of make it a bit easier, right? Or you can actually let them know where in particular the mistakes are made, right? Okay, I think we should demand of students when we should actually, yeah. Obviously, I'm just giving you like a list of strategies that exist, right? And you choose the ones that work better with your students. Obviously, you know your students better. Sometimes I teach several groups of the same, more or less, like the same subject to several groups, and I use ones with like a couple of types of these strategies with one group, and I use different strategies with this group, with another group, because I know that it works better this way, right? You know your students better. My task is just to share what, to give you that toolkit, right? And you can choose yourself. Now, there are 2 other types of error correction strategies. We might give focused corrective feedback and unfocused corrective feedback. Now that's pretty self-explanatory. You might actually guess what the difference is. Obviously, they are the opposites, right? So let me show you focused corrective feedback by looking at the example of using this strategy. You might guess what's the point here, right? When we use focused corrective feedback, what's the point? Again, there are some debates over focused corrective feedback, whether it can be used or not, but research shows that actually focused corrective feedback works very well when it comes to correcting certain types of mistakes. And the point here is actually being focused, being selective, right? Have a look, what types of mistakes have I corrected here? I have bought, I bought instead of have bought, new book yesterday, right? I'm focusing only on the way they used the tense, right? I didn't buy the new pants yet. I have not bought the new pants yet. I didn't start, and it should be I haven't started. Read book I bought yesterday, I will do it tomorrow. Now obviously there are a few more mistakes than the ones I have highlighted in this piece of writing, and I did not correct them in this piece of writing for reason, because this piece of writing was produced after we covered exactly the day when we, let's imagine, studied past simple and present perfect, right? And I want to focus the attention of my student on this particular, on the use of these two particular tenses. Now again, as some of you have already mentioned, right, I can focus on this type of mistakes, but I can also let our students know that there are a few other mistakes, but in a different way, right? Maybe use a different color, or maybe you can go with direct corrective feedback when focusing on tenses, and you may use indirect corrective feedback, only highlighting, right, when focusing on other types of mistakes. Now focusing, it's being able to be selective when correcting our students' writing, right? Now again, obviously there are very obvious mistakes with articles, but sometimes our students misuse articles. Actually, a lot of students misuse articles all the time, but there are so many more important mistakes in their piece of writing which really stand out. All right, there are some problems with articles, but let me focus on this because this is something that is particularly inappropriate, right? Now, I did it this way just to show you, to get to, to elicit this strategy from you, but obviously you might kind of let our student know that there are some other mistakes, but in a little bit different way, right? Maybe in the way that stands out a bit less, right? Because you want to actually drag the attention of your students on this particular bit, right, on the use of these two tenses. And it can be unfocused corrective feedback when you correct pretty much everything. Now, you can go with this type of feedback right after you cover this or that topic, for example, right, and you really want this or that topic, or these or that, these mistakes, the mistakes of this on this rule stand out for your learners, right? But when it's just a regular piece of writing, you can go with unfocused corrective feedback, which means you are not focusing on anything. You correct articles, you correct gerunds, right? You correct tenses, you correct everything. Now, this is unfocused feedback, but is it direct unfocused feedback or indirect unfocused feedback? What do you think? Do you remember the difference of direct feedback and indirect feedback? Well, obviously, I am giving the correct answer to our learners, right? The correct answers, right? So obviously it is direct corrective feedback. Have a look at this little mistake. What do you think this mistake is? This one, a little R missing in tomorrow. Do you think at this level our student knows how to write the word tomorrow? Well, we don't know for sure, but probably they do, right? Probably they know how to write this word, so that might be an accidental mistake, right? And what do we call accidental mistakes? It might be a slip, right? Okay. Direct feedback. Anton, Olga have just written that it's direct feedback, and it is. It definitely is. Thank you so much. So, have a look. Here I tried to mix and match some strategies, right? We have indirect corrective feedback. So I'm not correcting mistakes. I want to get my students to correct their mistakes themselves, right? and I'm actually focusing, right, on the use of the tenses. So it's indirect corrective feedback focused on present perfect and past simple. You see, now you have 4 strategies so far, and you can mix and match them, right? You can go with indirect focused feedback, with direct unfocused feedback, which will probably be the easiest, right? You correct everything and you actually provide them with the correct answer. Now, you can go with focused feedback, but you can, let's say, you can mix and match. You can go with the focused and unfocused feedback at the same time, but you choose, let's say, direct feedback to correct something that they have just studied, let's say irregular verbs. They don't know how to use them very well yet. They haven't like brought it to perfection yet. And you can go with indirect feedback at the same time to correct all other types of mistakes, right? So I can actually mix all of them at once. It's asleep, indeed. Tomorrow, that one is asleep, but I'm not correcting it here. Why? Because I'm focusing on present simple and present perfect and past simple. There is one more strategy, which is metalinguistic corrective feedback. Now, the point of metalinguistic corrective feedback is actually providing our learners with some linguistic information about the mistake that they've made. Now, we can do it with the use of, what do you call these? With the use of different error codes, right? Now, I've given you here the most common and widely used types of error codes, but actually, honestly, you can come up with your own error codes. The only thing is that you should make sure that your students are aware of what your little symbols mean. I remember my first year of teaching. I was teaching students and at university, and I was really very passionate about correcting their writing, and I used a wide range of those error codes. I even invented my own error codes, and it was not until May when they asked, amazing, thank you, so when they actually told me that, like, they thanked me for very comprehensive feedback, but like the only thing, what do those little things mean? Like, seriously, I used those codes of mine all year without making sure that my students actually know what they mean, right? Did I use them for myself? Probably yes, but actually, like, why would I do that for myself? I didn't really need it. We use error codes not just to look professional, writing those teacher symbols in the margins, but we use them for our learners. So a very important thing is to make sure they actually know what this WW means or WO means. Now, if we talk about primary school students, right, or maybe even preschool learners, is it a good idea to write all those abbreviations like wrong word, word formation, preposition, gerund? Probably they don't need it, right? Maybe you can come up with some other symbols, right? With some other codes. You need to have this sort of like shared code with them, right? Because this is for them. And you should probably maybe use error codes with students with like better developed language awareness, right? When they actually need it, right? Now, metalinguistic, these are error codes, right? You can see. So I label the mistakes with different abbreviations, right? To let our students know that these are articles. Therefore, we might actually refer them to that section in their grammar book about articles, right? Now, I used T here for tenses, but I actually can criticize myself for that here because there are so many tenses in the English language that might actually not be very helpful, right? What tense is that, right? You might actually specify what tenses have they just misused, right? Or did they misuse in this particular piece of writing, right? Again, you can introduce air codes and actually correct mistakes. That will be meta-linguistic feedback and direct feedback, right? All together. You can actually not correct the mistakes, but only underline the bits of text and put a little label, so you know that there is a problem with an article, but try to figure it out yourself. Or you can actually not correct anything, just write air codes here in the margins. In this line, there is a problem with an article. In this line, there is a problem with the tense. In this line, there is a spelling mistake, right? Without actually marking anything here. So you make this task a bit more complex, right? They will actually have to read into every single word of theirs, trying to figure out what the mistake is, right? So you actually, by giving feedback in this way, you give a language task. It's like an exercise, right, to your learner, but like the material, the sentences are not the ones you borrow from the book, but are actually produced by the student themselves. Isn't it amazing? Another kind of way of giving meta-linguistic feedback is actually writing a very brief comment explaining the rule, right? So, for example, you have corrected a mistake. You can put a little number here, for example, number 1, and write down here. We use present perfect, have, has, plus past participle when there is a time reference to a specific, well, we actually don't use present perfect, right? We use past simple, right? When there is a time reference to a specific moment in the past, right? There is a mistake. You see, sometimes the mistake can be, like the problem can be that you can mess up when writing your meta-linguistic comments, which is another skill, right? Which we need to practice, and we're going actually to practice it. May I ask you to find a mistake in my little comment? Yeah, I'm afraid there is a slip. It's actually not a slip, it's a mistake, right? It's much more important than just a slip, right? It should be, we use past simple when there is a time reference to a specific moment in the past. But I have a question. What has Anton just done? What type of error correction has he just used? Did he write, I'm sorry, there should be past simple instead of present perfect in your comment? No, he said, I'm sorry, I'm afraid there is a mistake. Therefore, he addressed me back to my comment so I can read through it, right, and correct it myself. What type of strategy was that? It was obviously indirect feedback. Thank you so much, because Anton probably thinks that I myself know that, right? So he asked me to do it myself. I did it myself, and therefore we corrected my mistake using indirect corrective feedback, right? Make sure there is past simple in here. Okay, thank you so much. And we have one more strategy, right, to share with you, which is reformulation. Now, let's have a look at this sentence. I go often to the village on the holiday for spend time with my family because I very much like it. Now, there are but there are quite a few mistakes in only, what, like 10 words, 12 words? So in this case, if we start correcting every single thing using air codes, little errors, our own symbols, we might actually, it might take to, it might actually not even look very comprehensible, right? We can, like, if we circle, put little errors, this should go here, this should go here, you don't need it here, here there is another mistake, a word is missing here. It is not helpful because there is too much red or green or whatever color you choose, right? So sometimes, but that's actually, don't overuse it, right? You can go with reformulation. You can just offer your student a more natural way of saying the same thing, right? So I often go to the village to spend time with my family because I like it very much. There is one potential risk when you go with this error correction strategy. When you try to reformulate, when your student has written, you make sure that you do not change the idea, right? The idea of the original idea of your student, because there is a very high risk of appropriating your student writing, or when you're changing the language, you're not helping them to formulate what they meant. And when we talk about communicative language approach, it's very important that they actually fulfill their need to communicate, to deliver a message, but you help them only with the language without changing the idea. But it might be very hard when reformulating their sentences. Sometimes it's not even hard to understand what they mean, and in this case, instead of actually correcting this mistake yourself, or reformulating it, if you didn't quite get what they meant, you better put maybe a question mark, ask them, what did you mean in particular? I'm afraid I can't really understand it right now, and maybe address them in class. Make sure using questions what they meant and help them formulate it themselves, right? So this is the last strategy that I wanted to share with you today. Now, researchers, by the way, say that this strategy works particularly well when it comes to working with the style, with register, or with syntactic problems like word order, for example, right? When all you can do is just actually offer them a more natural way of doing it, right? Sometimes there's just Runglish, right? Just they wouldn't say it in English just because they wouldn't, right? You can't even explain that. So, okay, so can you remember the reading corrective strategies that we discussed today in this webinar? What are they? Do you remember what are the error correction strategies, which you can, by the way, mix and match, right? When assessing your student writing, you can use several ones at the time. The most important thing is that when you go with this or that strategy, you're very, you do it consciously. You understand why you do it, right? So, meanwhile, I have just one question. Would you advise correcting all the mistakes or just the ones related to the grammar being studied at the moment? It depends. That's a very good question, Nadezhda. Thank you so much. I would say that it depends. Again, you can, if it's it depends on the goal of the written task you gave to your student. If of course I'm really very interested what John did last summer, but I'm particularly interested in how well he can use past simple, then yes, in this case you can actually focus on those. But you can let your student maybe orally, right, in a little conversation, know there are a couple of other problems, I just didn't focus on them now. I marked only these things because this is what the focus in the task was, right? In other pieces of writing, you can correct everything if it's a writing skills task, right? Or you can mix and match again. You can use direct corrective feedback to correct target language, and you can use, I don't know, maybe another color, or indirect corrective feedback, or just error codes, right, when correcting other mistakes. Okay, so we talked about direct feedback, which means actually providing our learner with the correct way of writing this or that bit, right? Okay, Anai, right? We can use indirect corrective feedback, right? Which is not providing our student with the correct way of writing this or that sentence, but just letting them know that there are some mistakes. Focused when we're focusing on a specific type of mistakes. Unfocused when we're correcting pretty much everything. Meta-linguistic feedback when we give some linguistic information about the mistakes made via, for example, error codes, or writing little meta-linguistic comments which you write correctly, you check, you make sure that you don't mislead your learners, right? And reformulation, when you just provide a more natural way of formulating the very same idea. Now, next time we are going to have a more sort of practice-oriented webinar, and we're actually going to work with the real pieces of writing of learners of English, and we're going to try and use different strategies that we talked about today in action. Thank you so much for your attention. It was a pleasure to talk to you today, and I'll see you next time.